Hello, and a very warm welcome to this conversation with Adam Price, the leader of Plaid Cymru. I'm Bronwen Maddox, the director of the Institute for Government. Well, we're going to be talking about all kinds of things, State of the Union, the upcoming elections in May, and coronavirus and Brexit, and how devolution might take its course. All that to come. Let me just kick off with a few housekeeping rules, which we can't get away with. And most important, Adam Price may be called upon to vote on a piece of legislation, I think, involving the curriculum in Wales, possibly around 5:15, and in which case he will sadly have to leave us at that point. So this is an extra incentive for you to send in your questions beginning right now, and I can scoop them up into the ones that I'm going to be asking him. If you want to do that, I really urge you to, put your question into the question and answer panel that you'll see on the right of your screen. We're going to be live tweeting from IFG events using the hashtag IFGDevo. Please do follow and tweet along. We're going to have a video and sound recording of this up within 24 hours. And that is about it. Well, Adam Price isn't going to need a long introduction to those of you who are very interested in these issues, and there are many of you we know at the IFG. Something we've been writing about these questions in a lot of detail. He has been leader of Plaid Cymru since 2018. He's been member of the Senedd since 2016 and was a long spell as an MP from 2001 till 2010, when he made himself known on many fronts, including challenging Tony Blair very vigorously over the Iraq War. We're going to draw, I expect, in this conversation on his background in economics and his spell at Harvard, with a master's in public administration. Well, with all that, and not to take up time from what we actually want to talk about, Adam Price, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Bronwen, really good to be with you this afternoon.
Great. Well, let's start where we are in a moment with the inescapable, with coronavirus. How would you say Wales has done during coronavirus compared to the rest of the UK?
I think by and large, the Welsh Government has done better. And certainly that's reflected, I think, in the stronger public approval ratings for the record of the Welsh Government vis-a-vis the Westminster Government. And I think it's certainly in the early phase of the pandemic. I think some of the same mistakes were made by the Welsh Government. So particularly moving too late into lockdown in that early phase, moving away from test and trace, the WHO mantra, and not enough focus on the care sector. But as we got into the pandemic, I think the Welsh Government almost discovered their ability to have an independent sphere of action. They appointed their own scientific advisors, the Technical Advisory Cell, and they marshalled Welsh resources. To give you one example of that, the record and contact tracing, crucial element in that test and trace system when it was re-established. In Wales, we've achieved a much higher level generally in contact tracing. Why? Because it wasn't outsourced to the large private sector conglomerates, and there's been a lot of criticism about that in England, hasn't there? It was actually embedded within public sector, within local authorities, people that had deep local knowledge and were able to engage much more effectively with the public and have a better result, a better success as a result.
I think, there is a sense in which coronavirus was the first time that many people, maybe in Wales, but certainly in the rest of the UK, realised the kind of powers that the Welsh Government had to do things a bit differently, including determine whether or not people from other parts of the UK could go into Wales. And as you said, there was a distinct sense of difference, which perhaps grew more sure-footed during all this. On the other hand, when you look at the figures of number of deaths, very sadly, Wales has actually got the worst record of any part of the three nations of the UK and Northern Ireland. Quite a lot worse than the UK average. I think the figures at the end of January for the 11 months were very sad, 214 deaths per 100,000 compared to the UK average of just under 204. It's quite a lot worse. What would you say to Wales and to the rest of the UK about why Wales has suffered more deaths for its share of population than any other part of the UK.
Yeah, I think answering in detail the question of the relative success or failure of the different governments, we'll only know that when we get the public inquiry. But I think what those figures, I believe, point to is, if you like, the prior pandemic of poverty and inequality. And we know from not just looking across the different nations of the UK and the different communities, but also across the world. Certainly in developed countries, it's those countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, that have deeper inequality that have fared worse. And I think it points to this chronic problem of deep inequality that actually was there before the pandemic, and the pandemic has shone an incredibly stark light as the role of housing, for example, in terms of understanding the different pattern of disease, and certainly in terms of low pay. If you basically cannot survive on the appallingly low levels of financial support that have been provided by the UK government, then even though you're meant to isolate, that isn't a real option for you in many cases. And so people that have to go out to work, those key workers that have to put themselves in positions where they're more likely to contract the disease, etc. So what we've seen through the pandemic, I think, is the deep inequality that was there all along surfaced like never before. And that does raise questions, difficult questions, I think, probably for the Labour government as well, because when we look at, give you one statistic, almost 1 in 3 of our children in Wales live in poverty. In an advanced economy, that's a disgrace. And I think these deeper questions of poverty and inequality now have come to the fore as a result of the experience of the last 12 months.
Yeah. One of the things I thought you might say there was that Wales has a much older population than other parts of the UK. And as we know, our age is very closely correlated with vulnerability to the worst of coronavirus. Well, we might come back to those points. But I must say it still sticks with me when you look at the Welsh Government record, for which, as you rightly say, there is a lot of support in Wales for its handling of coronavirus. And you look at things like slightly earlier lockdowns in September and so on. It's hard, I must say, to see the effect of all that, though, in the figures, because Wales has still suffered basically what the rest of the UK has, which is about 2/3 of its deaths falling since September, which is, and it's something we at the IFG have thrown at the UK government overall. All kinds of things, just saying, look, this is not a tribute to government. It is not a sign of great performance if 2/3 of the deaths have happened since September. But it's hard. It's hard to find a sense that where the decisions the Welsh government have made in any way led to a better performance in this.
It raises, doesn't it? And this has been discussed in Scotland as well. It points to the distinction between reserved and devolved powers, because we know from around the world that the question of borders and closing borders, and it's become an issue of some political disagreement over the last few months in Westminster as well. The failure of the Westminster government really to move quickly enough and follow the scientific advice in terms of closing borders and the effect of new variants. That is an entirely reserved matter, though. The Welsh and Scottish governments have followed probably a more stringent policy, but of course they're limited by their powers. And similarly, on the economic side, if you don't have the public health policy aligned with the economic and financial support, then that undermines the health policy. I can give you one classic example of that, Bronwen. The Welsh government, I'm sure, their own scientific advisors advised them to go for a longer fire break, as they called it, a lockdown back in the autumn. They decided that they could only go for around 2 weeks. Why? Because the furlough was coming to the end of October. They asked the UK Treasury to extend it. They refused. Only then, a few weeks later, of course, when England was about to go into lockdown, that decision was reversed. But it was too late, the decision for the Welsh government to reverse their decision. So that's why Yes, they're within a system of devolution. Of course, you have some degree of independent action, but there are important limits, and I think that's been borne out. And as Devi Strider has said in Scotland, an independent Scotland, she said she's a respected voice in these matters. Of course, would have fared better than was possible within the union.
Let's take your point then to move on to some of these questions of independence, which you've been arguing about eloquently for some time, but particularly in the last couple of months. And obviously, we have the elections to the Senate in May coming up. And the point you make there about independence and the possible values of it. The Chancellor, about to give his budget tomorrow, might say, well, look, this actually shows the value of being part of the UK. Because of being part of the UK, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, every part of the UK was able to draw on the ability to offer a furlough scheme, to draw on the huge borrowing powers of the UK government, which an independent nation wouldn't have.
Well, I mean, every independent nation, every sovereign independent nation has the same ability to borrow, or indeed even to use monetary financing as an alternative if they have their own independent currency in a central bank. So that's what every country in the world has done. And I think when we look across Europe, even across the world, I mean, many of the great success stories have been small independent countries. And so we look within Europe at countries like Norway, for example, Denmark, even, and certainly we're all familiar with the New Zealand example. Okay, every circumstance is different, but many of those great success stories, not just in public health terms, but also in economic terms, and the two have tended to go together. The countries that have been successful in terms of driving down the level of disease, acting with agility, and that is one of the features, I think, Bronwen, that you tend to see with many small independent countries. They are more agile. They don't have the sort of super tanker effect that often bedevils larger bureaucracies like the UK. And if you look at many of the mistakes that were made in the course of this pandemic policy, and remember, the UK has one of the worst death rates per head of population anywhere in the world. So this is not a success. If unionists are arguing that the pandemic is the best, the record on the pandemic is the best argument for the union, then things have got looking very, very poor indeed in terms of arguments for the union, because it has been a sorry episode, and many people have lost their lives unnecessarily as a result. And when we do look at small independent countries, I have to say there are some far better templates that we could have followed. And if we were a small independent country, then we could have availed ourselves of those different tools and levers ourselves, and I think done a far better job.
People might argue with some points of that, and in fact, I did pause when you were saying that every country has the same ability to borrow if they have an independent currency and so on, and that's quite an if for a start. But also, whether how much they can borrow and on what terms depends enormously on the world's judgment about their ability to pay it back, and therefore its judgment of their economic health.
Well, yeah, I don't think that there's any argument that Wales, an independent Wales, an economy of 65 billion plus, would be a member of the OECD. We in global terms, we are an advanced economy. So I don't think there's any doubt that we would, as a sovereign independent country, have an ability to borrow. And as I said, if we had our own central bank and currency, we would also be able to use monetary financing, of which there's obviously been there's been a very rich debate about the role of monetary financing, and we probably don't have time to go into that in detail, but certainly as part of the normal armory of sovereign independent countries, it would also be available to us. We certainly have a greater ability to borrow than we have now as a country. We are literally capped at £1 billion at a time, Bronwen, as you know, uniquely, the world has sovereign independent governments in advanced economies have negative interest rates. There has not ever been a better time to invest in the future, etc. So both in terms of dealing with the crisis, but also what happens next, the recovery, then actually I'm frustrated that we don't have those levers available to us, because if we are going to get to grips with the fact as to why we have these deep pockets of inequality and poverty, and they've been there generation after generation, the only way we're going to address that is put Wales on a different path. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have at least one arm tied behind our backs, and we're probably blindfolded a lot of the time as well.
Let's just dwell on this, your pitch for independence a little bit more, because it is the polls. It's not running. Support doesn't seem to be running at more than about 20-something%. On the other hand, there is a degree of vitality in this conversation that you've argued wasn't there a couple of years ago, and I think many would agree with that. People are turning it over in their minds. What happens if Scotland were to go independent? What happens if there are reunification of Ireland and so on? What would happen to Wales then? And you've written a lot on this. So perhaps just take us into it a bit. What do you do with what, to many people, not to reduce it all to economics, as we saw with Brexit, economics does not answer all these questions, doesn't touch the spirit of them. But for Wales, it is a big question. There is a big deficit between what it spends on public services and so on, and the revenues it might expect to get. And people, it depends which year you take, but in recent years, between about 13 and 15 billion a year, or coming up to about a fifth of its GDP. And its GDP per head is about 3/4 of the UK average. So this is starting from a very, very difficult position. What do you say about how Wales would pay for itself?
There's lots of things to say about this. Let's start with one pretty fundamental point. So our starting point is that we would just play back the question and reverse the logic. So people often ask, well, is Wales too poor to be independent? And it really relates to your core point. And we would say, well, look, Wales is poor because it's not independent, and the fiscal gap that you refer to, that is a function, that is a consequence of Wales's relative economic underdevelopment, and so then you've got to drill down into the question, well, why are we underperforming relative to our potential? And we would say that is because of the highly centralized nature of the economy of the UK. It's probably one of the most centralized, not just economically, but probably politically, culturally, and financially, and everything else. And indeed, outside of London and the southeast, pretty much every part of the UK is running a fiscal deficit, even in normal times, and that reflects.
So that's to describe the situation as it is.
Yes, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So how would an independent Wales do something about that?
Well,
really, pretty much instantly. How does it pay its way?
Number one point is that if we continue on the path that we're on, which is to remain within this highly centralized union, then that will be the position forever, and then we're being asked to accept a position of relative impoverishment forever and a day. So that's not an option that we're prepared to accept. Well, in terms of the dynamic position, because yes, by the way, I mean, in terms of the fiscal gap, that isn't the fiscal position of an independent Wales. And I think that even most economists accept that. That's the fiscal position within the UK. You'd have to disentangle, so there are certain things that are counted in those figures that an independent, here's an exclusive for the IOG, there will be no independent nuclear deterrent for independent Wales. So we'll take that off the books. And there are various other things which mean that the fiscal position of an independent Wales is a slightly different, different position. But
actually, even though that was done in parenthesis and very elegantly, I just pick you up on that. But there have been various reports on this, as you know, one by the Cardiff University and the Commission on Independence and so on. If actually what you're saying is Wales would not contribute to the cost of defending the UK, that it would, in any deal with the rest of the UK or with England, say we're not going to contribute to defence at all. We'll be a free rider on what England or the UK do in the way of defence. That's something that England, UK might well not accept in any deal, and there would have to be a deal.
Well, specifically, well, I mean, if we're an independent country, then I think we one of the benefits of that is you decide your own defence and foreign policy, and we can avoid some of the terrible crimes of illegal wars that you alluded to earlier. So that's probably a benefit from that perspective. I mean, I think generally speaking, we would expect Wales to spend at around the level of most similar independent countries of similar size, and so that gives you a very, very different level of defence expenditure per head to begin with. And look, there are other things within that figure that actually wouldn't be exactly the same for independent Wales. Indeed, the Wales government sent a report that you referred to explicitly say in the report, this is not the fiscal position of an independent Wales. And
we don't have time to go into a lot of these details.
And also, I mean, look, I think the bigger point, Bronwen, is this: is the dynamic question. As we, as economists, we differentiate between the static position and the dynamic position. What is going to change? And that's the prize. That's the purpose of independence, because it is our contention. It is our belief. And based upon the experience of other small independent countries that having achieved independence have gone on a far more prosperous trajectory than hitherto, we believe that Wales has latent potential that is currently not being realised. And you know, there's good objective reasons to argue as to why that is true.
Let's come on to this, because you said earlier, look, Wales is poor because it's not independent. Well, people might challenge that and say, look, Wales is poor because it's not generating enough wealth. It doesn't have the businesses and so on, and maybe that draws on the lack of investment in education and universities over the years, among other things, and in business investment. So what would, other than saying it's small, therefore it can be agile, this was something you wrote on at Harvard, I believe, the advantages of small countries. But what would Wales do to turn itself around, looking at other small countries, if you like?
Well, it's a good intellectual exercise to ask yourself, if you could only do one thing, what would it be? You never do just one thing in economic policy, but here goes. If you did one thing, then what would it be? You would massively invest in human capital. We have been underinvesting Wales now in human capital, certainly over the last few decades. And to give you just one example, you know, and this is kind of slightly counter-cultural for us, because there was always been historically a big emphasis on education as a route out of poverty, but in the last 10 years we've cut in real terms per pupil spending in our schools, for example. That's a disastrous short-sighted policy. So the first thing that you would do is massively change the political equation in terms of investment in human capital. You talked about our universities. Well, there are interesting things you can do, Bronwen, as a sovereign independent country that you can't do currently. So you can look at R&D tax credits, for example, and there are good examples of, you know, the Netherlands, etc., where they've been much more creative than us. And I say, well, these are treasury decisions, and you would say, well, look, okay, where's our competitive advantage? How can we align the key institutions like our universities that we have, and then how do we actually create a supportive tax policy which invests in those areas where we believe we can develop further? Now, that's the kind of thing that independent countries do all of the time, and small independent countries, as I wrote in the paper from Harvard, do it very well. They're very agile. They're very good at knowing themselves, at knowing where their key strengths are. They're very good at reacting and responding to opportunities in the world. Why? Small countries are exporters, and so they're very attuned to the world outside. And
some exporters. Let's just stay on the education point for a second, because you're describing an area in which Wales, in fact, does have devolved competence in the jargon. It has had control over its own affairs. And yet, as you described it, this Wales, acting within the independence it does have at the moment, has chosen to cut funding per head, and has school results, to the extent you can compare them. The IFG is doing work on this. But to the extent you can compare them, below the rest of the UK and below the OECD average in reading and maths. Why has that happened?
I think it is. I think it's partly a function of the cut in real terms that's happened over the last 10 years. The Welsh Government has just recently published its own research, which has shown the extent of the real terms cut going back to 2010. And the evidence the evidence around the world does show some correlation between the level of expenditure on education. Of course, it depends what you spend it on, but particularly there are threshold levels in terms of the number of teachers, etc., which have a big effect on the ability to achieve and close educational attainment gap. That's one of the problems as well within Wales, is we haven't really seen any progress in terms of narrowing the educational attainment gap to any large degree. And so there is the problem of relative underperformance as a whole of a nation, but also within Wales as well. And that is that. And if you on top of that, Bronwen, there's also the underinvestment in our FE and HE sector. So the FE sector, vocational education, has been as much of a Cinderella sector in Wales as it has in England, but a critical failure. And we know that looking at all successful economies across Europe, we know that actually putting a equal value on vocational education, not just talking the language of lifelong learning. We've dismantled adult education in Wales to all intents and purposes over the last 15 years or so. And then when we come to our university level, critically important institutions in terms of economic success, and yet we have underinvested in them. And these have been massive failures. They haven't been given the priority that they deserve.
Yeah, and there's, it slightly goes against your argument that independence on its own is a recipe for success. But we might tease this out in the questions.
Well, I think that clearly within with every government in any situation, of course, have choices to make. I think that to just contradict you slightly, the reason why the Welsh government, I think, have they haven't prioritised those areas of expenditure because they have prioritised others, and because, of course, they have had limits on their expenditure, particularly on the borrowing side, imposed by Westminster. And they haven't had the ability to invest that an independent country would have had. So I think that yes, you're right that the wrong political choices have been made, but obviously many of them have been within constraints set by Westminster. My beef with the Welsh Labour government is look, yes, you have limits, yes, you have constraints, but you should be pushing away at them. You should be pushing them to the limit and showing that kind of creativity and ambition. And that's the bit where they've fallen down. Yes, part of the blame lies with the Westminster government, but you just can't then rest on your laurels, as it were, or just accept the inevitability of that.
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you for that. And let's go on to some of the questions, which are terrific questions, and they're coming in a steady stream now. Thanks. Please keep them coming. Let me start one still on money. The person hasn't put their name to this, but saying, how can Wales obtain the money that used to come from the EU, which was the old structural funds, and now it's going to be money from Westminster called the Shared Prosperity Fund. How's Wales going to get its share of that, and where would you like it to go?
Well, I mean, we were promised, weren't we, that Wales was going to lose a penny, and I don't think anyone believes that promise now. And it's still what's going to happen to the Shared Prosperity Fund, and it's still shrouded in mystery. But I think we can pretty accurately predict, based on what we've already been told, that that money is going to be directed from Westminster. We're going to have very limited ability to decide where we would like to invest it within Wales, and so and that's going to be incredibly difficult for us then to kind of shape a coherent national economic strategy when we've got much of the decision making made on capital projects, etc., being done down the M4 in Westminster.
So it looks like it is going to be down the M4 in Westminster. what's your pitch going to be? Where would you, given you probably do now have to pitch for it, where would you like it to go?
Well, I think the key economic challenge for the Welsh economy, I think, in the years ahead is to diversify and to really have an economic strategy which is based on a much more granular understanding of what I was referring to earlier. Where are our competitive advantages? Where are the sectors of the future that we can develop into? And that's the kind, and that involves, I think, building up the development bank. And so I think it's great that we have a Welsh-based financial institution. We need more, by the way, but we've got to be investing in growing our own. Our entire economic model over the last 60 years in Wales has been based on one simple idea, that salvation would come from elsewhere. We would get out the checkbook, invite foreign owned companies to come into Wales and employ us. And those days are over. And the writing has been on the wall for some time, and probably Brexit is the last gasp of that kind of mentality. And yet the Welsh government, despite using different language at times, they're still following the same policy. And that's not the way that the Welsh economy is going to realize its potential. We need to be investing in our own grounded small and medium-sized companies, working out where our competitive advantages lie. And one of the things that those companies need is they need investment. Too often we get a scenario in Wales where we do have successful companies. They grow to a certain level, and then they're bought up, and then we lose the management is then exported outside of Wales. And once you do that, you're on a declining trajectory then in terms of growing those companies any further. We need to be investing. We need to get
the capital out of those businesses, out of that sale, in order to reinvest, and in order to reinvest, for example, in knowledge economy or in vaccine development, or I mean it doesn't. Let me bring in. You've mentioned Brexit.
Yeah, you could argue that if we had a very well developed Welsh venture capital scene, so yeah, where yes, the profits from the sales were then reinvested in other business. We don't have that in the moment. So actually, the value just tends to disappear, and also some of the knowledge as well, because I mean that's the most valuable capital of all is knowledge capital, and that disappears from within these companies once we lose local ownership of them.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Let me bring in one. You mentioned Brexit very briefly, and we haven't touched on that at all, and it has an enormous impact on Wales. We've got one from Kenny Dick saying, why do you think the people of Wales voted narrowly in favour of Brexit?
I think there were many different reasons, and I wouldn't like to ascribe a particular one to all of those in Wales that did vote that way. Many of them were sincerely of the political belief that they didn't want to be part of a political union in the form of the EU. For others, I think it was. I think born of a sense of frustration and exasperation in many of those disadvantaged communities that felt that the political status quo and, if you like, the economic orthodoxy of some of which I've just referred to over the last 60 years hadn't delivered for them, and that this was an opportunity to express that sense of alienation. And again, I wouldn't ascribe that as a motive for everyone, out of respect for everyone's individual reasons for it. But I think there was certainly an element of that, and probably reflected in other similar post-industrial communities across the UK as well.
And where do you think sentiment is now on Brexit?
Well, I mean, according to the latest opinion polls, there's probably been a shift back towards regret, but I mean, these are only opinion polls, and who knows? I think that we have to accept now the world that we're in, and we have to make this work for the Welsh economy. It's a different it's an entirely different environment. We probably, Bronwen, going through an age of deglobalization. Even with the election of Joe Biden to the United States, we've seen Joe Biden adopt a sort of made in America policy, and so we're in a very, very different phase. And there are good technological reasons why manufacturing as well is coming back home a little bit. There's a bit of reshoring and onshoring, things like additive manufacturing, small batch production. So the economic landscape is changing, and there are threats for us there, certainly, when our economy has been structured around global supply chains in traditional sectors like automotive. But there are probably opportunities for us as well, and we've got to focus on some of those. And for instance, give you one example, Bronwen, the rules on public procurement, because we're now in the WTO, and we can specify local purchasing up to a certain threshold. We can even specify Welsh firms, even despite the internal market bill. We weren't able to do that in quite the same way before, and that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for import substitution. The £6.3 billion of public procurement that the Welsh government are responsible for, about 50% of that goes over the border to companies based in other parts of the UK or overseas. So that's an opportunity, and we need to see the opportunities and not just the threats.
Thank you for that. We take in one, a purely political one, if I can put it that way, from Simon Reeves, saying based on the St David's Day polls on Wales today and the number of seats projected for Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives, might you consider a coalition to dislodge Labour? I guess that's a coalition with the Conservatives. And the polls, I think, I'm not sure about that particular one, the polls have put you a close third behind the Conservatives in terms of possible numbers of seats, I think.
I think there were two on St David's Day. We always have more than one on St David's Day. Yeah, I think one put us in second place on seats, and the other one put us in third. So, yeah, no, there's a short answer to this question. No, there are no circumstances whatsoever that we would form a coalition with the Conservatives or or support a Conservative First Minister. We would never do that. I mean, we're poles apart politically, ideologically.
Okay. Thanks for that. All right, and then there's one just following on your comments from Malcolm, saying what measures can Wales and its government take in order to reduce the damage to Welsh businesses of Brexit, or indeed take hold of the opportunities if you're of a different persuasion on Brexit?
Well, yeah, I think certainly we need to be far more active in terms of our export strategy than we have been hitherto, because these non-tariff barriers, particularly given the sectors that Wales is specialised in, manufacturing, but also the particular areas within manufacturing, automotive and aerospace, the position of our food and farming sector, and we've seen particularly the problems of the shellfish producers recently, haven't we? So we're going to have to be a much more active partner to industry than we have been, and certainly that would be a major element of priority for us. We're going to set up an arm's length economic development agency, specialist agency. The OECD has said that is a glaring gap in Wales at the moment. So, and that can work actively then with business in these sectors that are finding it difficult because of the extra layers of bureaucracy that have resulted as a Brexit. But yes, as I said, there are opportunities as the world is changing around us. We have to adapt to that, and as export markets become more difficult, then looking at an import substitution approach is a sensible thing. In these markets, particularly in public procurement, where we can use actually the public pound, if you like, as a way to develop some of these infant industries that I referred to. So in some areas we can do, they call it innovative procurement, where we try and create a new market. And in some senses, what happened in the pandemic is going to be really interesting, isn't it? Because PPE, we were sourcing it from all over Asia, etc. But the Welsh Government started to identify manufacturers in Wales that could produce particular products, and we realised that actually in Wales we've still got a manufacturing base. We still make things to a greater extent than is true across the UK, and that actually is a strength for us as the economy shifts around us. So let's have that kind of active approach where we actually sit down with companies and say, well, look, what markets are you in now? What are you producing, and what else could you move into? What's the proximate market that you maybe actually could provide some opportunities with you, and how can we work with you, whether it's finance through the development bank, whether it's export advice through the network of international offices that Wales has across the world. That's the kind of attitude that we need from the Welsh Government, that is working side by side, rolling up its sleeves, if you like, with Welsh companies that are facing difficulties, but also have some new opportunities on their horizon as well.
Mm. Does Welsh farming have new opportunities? I mean, it's one of the things that Wales makes is sheep and cattle. Or is that really gone now that we're out of the EU?
Well, I think clearly this is an incredibly difficult time for farming, and on top of the insecurity that has arisen out of Brexit, then we've other concerns which are to do with the Welsh Government's policy on things like the basic payment. Basic payment is like basic income for farmers, right? I mean, basic income is popular amongst progressives, but we think in an insecure industry where income is really at the bottom, then the last thing you should do at this point is take away their basic payment, basic income. But secondly, then there's a controversy at the moment about creating an all Wales nitrate NVZ, nitrate vulnerable zone, which means that maybe there'll be additional costs of about up to 360 million on the farming industry. Well, where's that going to come from? And you'll end up, I mean, the only farm holdings that will be able to survive that double whammy, if you like, of lower income plus higher capital costs will be the large ones. And so you'll actually end up with kind of agribusiness effectively, and the final death knell of the family farm, and that would be a disaster socially and economically. I think farming does have actually a really strong and vibrant future, but we've got to transition and help the farmers, not actually work with them as part of this transition, because what I just referred to earlier, really, input substitution, there's a great opportunity there. We want to extend free school meals. We think it's an absolute scandal that 70,000 children in Wales who live in poverty currently don't receive free school meals. Well, let's actually combine that with a positive policy on local procurement and creating a Welsh food and farming system whereby you are actually using local farming and local food to deliver those free school meals. When you have limited funds, obviously even more limited while we're under Westminster, Bronwen, you've got to be smart. Policies have got to be deliver more than one goal, and the free school meals policy is an opportunity whereby we can inject some demand into Welsh farming. And by the way, it's make that part of the education process. We're moving to a new curriculum, which I'll be voting on in a few minutes now. But actually, why don't you then bring the farmers in? Take the children to the fields where the food that they're going to be eating, later that day is actually being produced as part of learning about the environment, as part of learning about economics and everything else.
Thank you for that. We've got an interesting one about, again, someone who hasn't put their name to it, but saying, is the First Minister, Mark Drakeford's call for home rule, that is a greater degree of devolution for Wales, but within the Union, is that a threat to the kind of arguments that you're making for independence? It is obviously a very different vision of Wales's position within the UK. It is a vision of Wales within the UK.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a response, isn't it? And not for the first time. I think the Labour Party moves when they feel the threat from Plaid Cymru, and that it's been like that for 40 years. I remember when Neil Kinnock changed his his stance of being, robustly anti-devolution, I think, in the middle of the Pontypridd by-election, where Plaid Cymru were polling very well. The problem, I think, is this: it doesn't solve the fundamentals. The fundamental issue is this: is how can you have federalism? And that's effectively what Home Rule is referring to, within an union where you have one of the constituent nations making up, 87% of the population. It will always be an imbalanced union, and on top of that, you have a tradition of Westminster parliamentary supremacy, and to what extent can you entrench? But even if you do entrench in a written constitution, you will still have the fundamental problem that the powers that are reserved at the federal level will always be determined by the political outcomes in the nation next door. And we have different political values. I mean, Wales has never voted, since the Reform Act, Wales has never, ever voted for a majority of Conservative MPs. And yet we've had Conservative governments for 2/3 of the time. And I think no one credibly argues that that's going to be any different anytime soon. I think for those democratic reasons, we believe that independence is the best solution. And that's why what's interesting is what's happening within the Labour Party's voter base. Because for the first time ever, and this is what's driving the surge in independence, is 50% of Labour voters, according to some opinion polls, are now they're not even indie curious, they're indie confident, to use the phraseology we're using now. And I think that's why the Labour Party is shifting its position. But I think they're being overtaken by events, and particularly amongst young people. Independence, he often accuses us in the independence movement of being backward-looking and inward-looking. It's the opposite, actually. We're the ones that are forward-looking. We're the ones that are talking about the future of Wales. We're the ones that want Wales to join in with the rest of the world and be internationalist and outward-looking. It's the British unionist project that has become backward-looking and inward-looking over the last few years.
Right, let me pick up just on your point about an internationalist Wales, if you like. And we've got several questions here in the panel about things like, would you look to join the euro? Would you adopt the Schengen area? But also one written in question saying, look, how would Wales ever be in a position to apply to rejoin the EU? Because the Welsh economy is so interwoven with England that it's someone in Wales writing, we would need to stay part of a single market with England until the Welsh economy had somehow been transformed so that Wales traded more with the EU than England.
Well, and these are issues, of course, that the Independence Commission report, which we published just before in December, goes into in some detail. And the conclusion that the Commission report came to, and it was supported by our membership in a special conference recently, is for those reasons, an independent Wales joining the EU immediately is not an option. And it's not an option that we embrace. We're a pro-European party, and so our ideal would be for Wales to join the European Union as an independent member, like the Republic of Ireland, at some point in the future. But we would not see that as a realistic option anywhere in the short to medium term. And for the reasons that if England remains outside the European Union, that does constrain our ability to join the European Union over that initial period. The question is right, of course, over the long term, as the Welsh economy develops and diversifies and internationalizes, and the relative weight in its trade with the rest of the world vis-a-vis compared to England, then obviously that would be a different issue. But that's in the long term, and so we accept and acknowledge that. In terms of
Adam, I'm going to actually interject from your own team and say that you've got to go and vote now.
Right. Yeah. There
which we could clearly.
Because we don't have division bells at the moment, but because we're working at home. But yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the prompt. Yeah.
Not at all. We got stacks more questions, and including very pointed ones about whether Wales would end up an economic annex to England and all kinds of things. And we're going to have to say that we will continue those some other time. Adam, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much indeed for.
I'm very grateful, and my chief whip is very grateful too.
Yeah, not at all. And everyone who's been watching and sending in questions, I'm sorry I could only get in a fraction. They were extremely good, intelligent questions. Please join us for our event with Andy Burnham on the 8th. Adam Price, thank you very much indeed for joining us.